was a wonderful talk by Dr. Sackhouse, and I was just marveling at how well his talk actually segues into my talk. And so it's as if somebody intelligently designed the program. So good job to the organizers. You know, it's interesting, I'm starting to get older and I'm beginning to feel the effects of my age. And a lot of the effects that I'm feeling have more to do with my pride than they actually have to do with my physical body. Because I'm finding, for example, that I'm getting invited to very different types of parties now that I'm getting older. It seems like not that long ago that my wife and I were dragging our kids on Saturday morning to Chuck E. Cheese to go to one of their friends' birthday parties. Now, do you guys in Canada have Chuck E. Cheese? No? You are a blessed people. If there's ever something that you could describe as hell on earth, it would be Chuck E. Cheese on a Saturday morning. But nevertheless, I'm now getting invited to retirement parties. A few months ago, one of our good friends invited my wife and I to a retirement party. She was retiring and wanted to celebrate that transition to the next stage in her life. You know, and I suspect there's more retirement parties coming our way. So it's a lot more fun actually to go to a retirement party than a birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. But nevertheless, that's happening. And of course, when you get that kind of an invitation in the mail, it triggers a conversation. So my wife and I are now talking about retirement. And we're beginning to plan for our retirement. You just don't roll out of bed and retire one day. You've got to think about what you're going to do and plan for it. And one of the conversations we have has to do with where would we like to retire? What would our dream home look like if we retired? And of course, we live in Southern California, so the conversation immediately turns to, can we retire on the beach? You know, and of course, we would love to, but we can't really realistically afford to do that. But when I think about dream retirement homes, I'm reminded of a story that I read a number of years ago, and I actually recount this story in my book, Who Was Adam?, about a British couple named the Howards who decided that they were going to retire in France, in the French countryside of Dordogne. And just for fun, this is what the French countryside looks like in Dordogne. It's beautiful, and they purchased a 17th century farmhouse on a property that had natural waterfalls. Can you imagine how beautiful that would be? And yet one day their idyllic dream retirement was interrupted by a knock on the door, and it was a spelunker. This guy was exploring a cave system and wound up in a cave underneath their property, and one of the chambers in the cave had all these rock engravings in there, and he came out of the cave and he found their house and he informed them of what he had discovered. And the next thing you know, their dream retirement is interrupted by all these archaeologists and anthropologists coming to their property to get into this cave site to begin to investigate what was being discovered there. These are rock engravings in this cave site that date at 25,000 years in age. And there was several hundred engravings in this particular cave site. And this is what the entrance of the cave looks like. And it's, of course, gated off to prevent people from going into the cave. And actually, the location of the cave entrance is on their property is secret, again, to prevent people from going into the cave site. Just for fun, this is what the interior of the cave looks like. And these are what some of the engravings look like. This is called, by the way, the Cusack Cave. And this is what some of the engravings look like. And these engravings are basically bison and rhinos and mammoths and horses primarily. And there's 1,000 yards of engravings where some of the engravings are 14 feet in length. And there's a place in the cave called the Grand Panel that has 150 overlapping engravings. Now, this particular location where the cave art is found is so deep within the cave system that archaeologists can only stay in that chamber for about 3 hours before they have to go to the surface because the CO2 levels are so high within the cave interior. So the people that made this art were deeply committed to making this art, and were making it in an incredibly inaccessible location within the cave. Now, this is of course, very interesting because it raises all kinds of questions about this cave art. Now, the artists were human beings like us, modern humans, that they were among the first humans to make their way to Europe. And that's who was making the art. But the question is, what were they trying to communicate? What was the purpose of this art? Now, most archaeologists that discover cave art view it very clinically. What was being depicted? What was the type of pigment that was used to make the cave paintings? Were there other archaeological artifacts associated with it? Are there human remains associated with it? What are the dates of the cave art? Those types of things. But there are a few brave anthropologists who try to understand the meaning and the purpose of the cave art. And it's fun to spend some time just thinking, what again are these human beings trying to communicate? What was the purpose of this art? Now, there are some people who say it was just simply art for the sake of art. That as human beings, we have this capacity called symbolism. And we have this compulsion to create and to express ourselves. And we do that in the form of language, we do that in the form of music, and we do that in the form of art. Not only pictorial art, but figurative art and portable art as well. And so some people think that this was just a manifestation of a human desire and need and compulsion to create. There are others who think that maybe this was a form of hunting magic. That before the hunt, these people were superstitious and they would go into the caves and they would draw or engrave the animals that they were about to kill. It's interesting, most of the cave art is of herbivores. There are very few carnivores depicted in this cave art, and very few humans, in fact. And so they thought, well, maybe the idea here is that you depict a bison and then that's going to give you good luck so that when you go out on the next hunt, you're going to have a greater chance of success. So maybe there was an element of superstition at play here. Some people think that maybe this was a form of totemism, where people had a religious orientation and thought that there was a spiritual realm and that the animals were kind of the spirit conduits, if you will. And so they had this connection to the animals because they saw the animals as, again, being animal spirits, if you will, that they, again, desired to worship or to appease in some capacity. The most interesting and perhaps the best model for what this cave art was intended to accomplish comes from David Lewis Williams, who argues that this is an example of shamanism. And the idea here is that these people had a very complex picture of the world, where there was not only the physical world, but a spiritual realm. And they recognized that what happened in the spiritual realm influenced the physical realm, and so these shaman were essentially the mediators, trying to influence the spirit realm to affect the physical realm in a way that would benefit human beings, would create stability, if you will, in their lives. And the idea was that deep within the earth was the location that was the closest to where this spiritual realm was, and that the cave walls represented the veil from between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. And so these shaman would take drugs, hallucinogens, enter an altered state of consciousness, and then coming out of this trance, they would then depict the visions on the cave walls. And this model actually accounts for the data very nicely. And I thought what would be kind of fun is for us to spend a few minutes before we kind of plow into a discussion as to what do I see the connection between this cave art and the image of God. Before we get into that, I'd like to just spend a few minutes showing you some of the pictures that have been painted in these cave walls, because they're fascinating. This is fascinating art, and again, it raises all kinds of provocative questions about what these humans were, again, trying to depict. What was the purpose of this art? By the way, there are about 350 cave sites throughout France, Germany, and Spain that contain cave art, and 160 examples of cave art, or at least caves with art in them, in France alone. Another French cave that displays art is called Chauvet. This cave art dates to about 32,000 years in age. And there are several thousand pictures in this particular cave. There are bison that are depicted. There are horses that are depicted in this cave. This is just to give you a sense of scale with respect to the art. interestingly enough, and you can sort of see this in this picture, the wall of the cave here was actually polished to be smooth before the art was painted on it. And the painting was done with charcoal, manganese oxide, and iron oxide as the pigments. So you get primarily blacks and reds in the paintings. And there's actually a three-dimensional element to the art where the artist would actually engrave within the painting itself to give it a three-dimensional pop. So pretty sophisticated techniques. This is an interesting picture in Chauvet of a deer that is extinct. We know that this deer lived at one time in Europe because we have fossil evidence of this deer. But from the cave art, interestingly enough, biologists can actually get a little bit of a sense of the biology of the creature. And by dating the cave art, you can get an idea when this particular creature went extinct. But it's interesting that the depictions of this creature are so detailed in some instances that it's actually part of the biological data set that scientists are using to understand this organism. There's also something very interesting in the cave art. There's also something rather interesting too about the cave art, and that is the appearance of what are called hand stencils. And there are two types of hand stencils that show up in the cave. One are basically made with, you have a pigment slurry that the hand was pressed in and then pushed against the wall. Those are called positive hand outlines or positive handprints. Then there's another type, which is shown here, where the pigment slurry was actually blown onto the hand through a tube and aerosolized and then covered the hand, and then when the hand was removed, you'd have the outline of the hand. And this is interesting because if you think about the cave wall as being the veil between the spiritual realm and the physical realm, this seems like an attempt to try to access or try to penetrate that veil to connect with that spiritual realm. And in fact, some places these handprints are in isolation. Other places there's hundreds of them on the wall. There are male prints, there are female prints. Again, rather provocative. Now, it's interesting, humans are very seldom depicted in the cave art. And when they are depicted, they're depicted as stick figures, which is really odd because there's all this attention to detail with the animals, but then when humans are depicted, they're depicted as stick figures. Sometimes they're called ghost figures. And compare that with the outline or the sketch of the bull just beneath the human ghost figures. Even though it's a sketch, it still shows quite a bit of detail. Why is that? Good question, isn't it? It's fascinating stuff. The Lascaux Cave was discovered in 1948, and the art in this cave is about 17,000 years old, and it's known for the Great Hall of Bulls. And this is giving you, again, a sense of scale, but also look where the art is produced. Look how high up on the cave wall the art was painted. That's amazing, isn't it? Look how large and how high up on the cave wall. Now, here's something that's interesting with respect to these bison, is notice all the black dots in this particular bison. There are many instances where you see these black dots showing up that are part of the cave art itself, and nobody knows, again, what the point of these dots are, but sometimes they seem to conform to a pattern that some people have suggested is actually a star map, where these artists were depicting the night sky within the bison themselves. Here is a picture of a horse. This is kind of an iconic image. And here are our deer again that have gone extinct. And again, some more bison. Altamira is also a famous cave. This is located in Spain. And this is an interesting cave site, because to get to the main chamber where the art is depicted, you have to go through a rather arduous 300-meter tunnel to get into this chamber where the cave art is depicted. And the cave art is actually painted on the ceiling, which ranges from 6 feet to 18 feet in height. And this is a bison that's found in the cave, but these are all on the ceiling. This art's all on the ceiling of the cave. And here again is another bison. Now, it's not just pictorial art that is found in these caves. We also have evidence for figurative art. And the oldest figurative art that we know of has been recovered from a cave site in Germany called the Hohenstein Cave, and this is the statue that's found in that cave site. It's about 1 foot in height. It's called the Lion Man, or the Lowenmensch. Nobody knows what the purpose of this statue was, but it's clearly zoomorphic, meaning that it's part human, part animal, again, communicating or connoting a sense of an imaginary world that these humans had and that they were desiring to depict. Now, something that's very interesting is that this cave art spans 25,000 years, from about 40,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, and it's unified in terms of its style, in terms of what's being depicted. There's no difference in the cave art between 40,000 years ago and 15,000 years ago. It's qualitatively the same type of art. And there's no evolution of art that you see in Europe. The art just shows up when humans make their way into Europe, and it's incredibly sophisticated art. It shows up out of nowhere. There's no evolution of art. It's called the Big Bang of art, the artistic Big Bang. Anthony Sinclair, in an article in Nature a few years ago, wrote, "The study of early art has been plagued by our desire to see this essentially human skill in a progressive evolutionary context. Simple artistic expressions should lead to latter, more sophisticated creations, yet for many outlets of artistic expression, cave paintings, textiles, ceramics, and musical instruments, the evidence increasingly refuses to fit. Instead of a gradual evolution of skills, the first modern humans in Europe were in fact astonishingly precocious artists." This is a mystery for many anthropologists. Is this, again, Big Bang of art? Now, there are some anthropologists who argued that this Big Bang of art was essentially unique to Europe, that human beings, as I mentioned last night, emerge about 100 to 150,000 years ago and only begin to migrate around the world about 60,000 years ago, according to the scientific data. And so the argument is that these first humans were anatomically modern humans, but they were behaviorally crude in their capacities, that they didn't have sophisticated behavior, and that when humans entered into Europe about 40,000 years ago, the sociocultural Big Bang happened, and suddenly the modern behavioral form of humanity emerges. That, in other words, there was a lag time, according to these anthropologists, between when the physical form of humanity emerged and the modern form of behavior emerged. A lag time of almost 100,000 years. That was the view that many anthropologists had, which is a very uncomfortable view, by the way, from a Christian perspective. But it's interesting, a few years ago, there was the discovery of cave art in a cave in Indonesia called the Sulawesi Cave that basically is identical to the cave art that you see in Europe. And this is a hand stencil that is found in that particular cave. It dates at almost 40,000 years in age. And in fact, you also see animals being depicted as well. There's an animal outline that's depicted that's very difficult to see in that particular picture. And in fact, this opened up the floodgates, and we now have examples of cave art in Southeast Asia that are not only found in Indonesia, but in Cambodia, Malaysia, China, and Australia that date at about 30 to 40,000 years in age. Now, this is rather significant because it means that the first humans that made their way into Asia and into Europe already possessed the capacity for artistic expression. And so Christopher Stringer, a very well-known anthropologist, says this: it is a really important find. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a creative explosion that was special to Europe and did not develop in other parts of the world until much later. The basis for this art was there 60,000 years ago. It may have even been there in Africa before 60,000 years ago and spread with modern humans. And in fact, we have examples of symbolism, which again is artistic expression is just one manifestation of something that anthropologists call symbolism. We have evidence for symbolism that goes back to almost 80,000 years ago, found in cave sites in South Africa. And these symbolic artifacts were produced by modern humans as well. We also have evidence for symbolism that is found in cave sites in Israel and in Algeria that date at 92,000 years in age, and then also in Israel at 100 to 135,000 years in age. So in other words, what we're seeing is that the evidence for behaviorally modern humans is pushing back closer and closer to the time when anatomically modern humans emerged. Meaning that when the anatomically modern forms of humans emerged, along with it came sophisticated behavior that we would recognize again as symbolism. So then how do you make sense of this? Cave art. Well, here's my perspective as a Christian, that this cave art is a manifestation of the image of God. Now, Dr. Stackhouse gave a wonderful, concise, but I think very insightful description of what the image of God is. And my view of the image of God is probably very similar to Dr. Stackhouse's. And I take a view that is a resemblance view. And there's a number of different views that Dr. Stackhouse laid out, that not only the resemblance view, but the representative view and the relational view for the image of God. I take a resemblance view where I think that human beings bear a resemblance, though imperfectly, but bear a resemblance to our Creator. And that resemblance is manifested in our intellectual capability, which would include symbolism, our capacity for abstract rational thought, or our desire to express ourselves creatively, our technical inventiveness. Those would be examples of, again, of those properties that I think are intertwined or connected with this idea of the image of God. We also have a moral component, an inherent understanding of right and wrong and a sense of justice. We are spiritual beings in that we have a sense of a reality beyond the physical material realm and a desire to connect to that reality. We also are relational beings where we relate to each other in complex social structures, but also, again, a desire to relate to that transcendent realm that we have a sense of. And so if you think about this cave art then, I would argue that this is evidence that human beings are made in God's image. I would take that as, again, a manifestation of the image of God, and the fact that you see this appearance of again, symbolism that coincides with the origin of humanity is consistent with what the biblical text teaches, that human beings were made in God's image. You would expect that the behavior of modern humans would line up with their biology in terms of origins, and this is what the data seems to indicate. Now, we live in a world where the prevailing view, however, for human origins is an evolutionary view that argues that human beings are the product of an evolutionary history that again spans about 6 to 7 million years, where these series of transitional forms called the hominins are essentially documenting in the fossil record this evolutionary ascent of man. And as part and parcel of this view is this idea that human beings are only different in degree, not different in then kind from other creatures, including the great apes. And in the famous words of Charles Darwin in his book, The Descent of Man, he says, in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. And so the idea here is that even though we as human beings display this remarkable property that we would call symbolism, scientifically speaking, or the image of God if you're a Christian, the argument is that ultimately that behavior that we display is only different in degree from that which we see in the great apes and in the hominins in the fossil record, that there really is nothing exceptional about human beings whatsoever. But this view, interestingly enough, is rapidly eroding among anthropologists and primatologists, because we now are seeing evidence in a sets of arguments that are being built by anthropologists who are not Christians, who are arguing that there really is such a thing as human exceptionalism. That is, human beings are not just different in degree from other creatures, we truly are different in kind. And one of those anthropologists who makes that argument is a guy by the name of Thomas Suddendorf in his book, The Gap, which is written again from an evolutionary perspective, but it's a provocative book along these lines. And I'm just going to read an extensive quote from the book, just so you can begin to see how anthropologists are changing the way they're viewing human beings, again, with the idea that human beings truly are exceptional, that we truly are one of a kind. Studendorf says this: we reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history, and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in the remaining forest. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds. Studendorf goes on to say this: we find two major features that set us apart. Our open-ended ability to imagine and reflect on different situations. This is, in effect, a manifestation of something called symbolism again. A key to our open-ended generative capacity is our ability to recursively embed one thing in another. In other words, we can represent the world as symbols, and then we can manipulate those symbols in an open-ended manner. And that's something that no other creature on the planet seems to be able to do. And that we also have a deep-seated drive to link our scenario-building minds together. That as human beings, we have this recognition that we possess a mind, and that everybody else in this room also is an individual that possesses a mind as well. And that we desire to connect one mind to another and link our minds together. Now, the tool that we're going to use to probe this question is going to be the archaeological record, where I'm going to argue that the artifacts in the archaeological record reflect the behavioral capacity of the creatures that produce those artifacts. And that if human beings truly bear God's image, our behavior is a manifestation of the imago Dei. Dead language, I just used the dead language. Did I get points for that? Because I'm going not for very good, but exceptional. But anyway, but the idea here is that if human beings truly bear the image of God, that again is going to manifest in terms of our behavior, and our behavior, and hence the archaeological record associated with humans, is going to be qualitatively different than with any other creature, any other hominin. Now, this is a very simple diagram showing in a broad brush sense what the archaeological record looks like. And arguably the very first tool use, at least stone tool use, is found with Homo habilis that dates at about 2.5 million years ago. And by the way, Homo habilis means handyman. Now, there are some people that are beginning to argue maybe the Australopithecines were using stone tools, or at least were producing some type of tool prior to the emergence of Homo habilis. But by and large, the archaeological record, at least unequivocally, indicates that Homo habilis was the first creature to make use of stone tools. And this is called the Oldowan technology, or the Mode 1 technology. And then we see that that technology remains rather static. It doesn't evolve, it remains static for quite a significant period of time. When Homo erectus appears on the scene, about 1.8 million years ago, we see a new technology in the archaeological record called the Acheulean, or the Mode 2 technology, associated exclusively with Homo erectus. And the technology is only slightly more sophisticated than that which you see for Homo habilis. This is a diagram showing what hominid technology looked like. Remember Tim the Toolman Taylor, where he wanted more power with his tools? Well, if you were a hominin and you wanted more power, you just got a bigger rock. Okay, because all this technology consists of, for Homo habilis, is taking a hammer stone and striking a core stone and producing flakes. And the flakes were the tools. And they were then used primarily to scavenge meat off the remains of dead animals. And then they were just dropped after they were used, and they were produced again when they were needed. They're called expedient tools. Homo erectus were making cleavers and hand axes and things like that, but all that meant was that they were simply taking the core stone and shaping it into 2 or 3 different types of forms. They were not doing anything more sophisticated than that. And as we'll see in a few minutes, this is the type of tool use that you actually observe among chimpanzees in the wild, by the way. Then when you have Neanderthals appearing on the scene, they employ a technology called Mousterian technology that is more sophisticated than that of Homo erectus, but is a far cry separated from that modern humans were engaged in. Neanderthal technology was crude and cumbersome by comparison to that of modern humans. Now, as I mentioned, and I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this, there's been some rather remarkable advances that have happened in primate behavior in the last decade or so. We now are recognizing that chimpanzees are doing some rather remarkable things in the wild. It's very tempting when you're looking at the archaeological record to see the behavior of the hominins, like again Homo habilis, erectus, and Neanderthals in the context of the origin of humanity, where you're saying, wow, look at that technology, seems to be progressively more and more sophisticated, and then it's just gradually giving way to the behavior shown by modern humans. But when you take another data point and you have another anchor point for comparison, namely that of the primates, you see a very different picture. Because people have observed chimpanzees in the wild manufacturing spears. They will take tree branches and go through a six-step manufacturing process to produce a spear that they actually will use to hunt bush babies. This is the same thing Homo erectus and Neanderthal were doing, qualitatively speaking. In addition to that, these creatures make pretty sophisticated tools, actually, to extract termites from nests. They make stone tools, just like that of Homo habilis. Chimpanzees have been observed occupying caves when the environmental conditions become intolerable. Chimpanzees make very elaborate beds high up in trees out of highly specialized materials that have the right tensile properties to produce these comfortable beds, and they line the beds with plants that are natural insect repellents. These creatures are doing some amazing things. They mourn their dead. People have observed this both in the wild and in captivity. There's a real mourning process. So the hominins likely mourn their dead as well, and there looks like there are burials that these hominins engaged in. But that burial practice is very different than what you see modern humans engaged in, but it's much more similar to that of chimpanzees. And they even use medicinal plants. Chimpanzees will medicate themselves using certain plants in the wild. And people have claimed that Neanderthals are doing the same thing. So what I'm saying to you is that when you look at the behavior of these hominins relative to chimps and relative to modern humans, the hominins are behaving much more like chimpanzees than they are like modern humans. There really is a gulf between human behavior and that of the hominins. Now, how many of you have heard the claim that Neanderthals made art? A few of you. Well, this claim is out there, and if you pick up popular science articles, you see this claim all the time. And what I want to do now is look at the claims that people have made where they argue that Neanderthals are engaged in art. Because if they are, then that means that they indeed possess symbolic capabilities, which is, I think, problematic, at least from my particular perspective, with regard to, again, the idea that there's a scientific case that can be made for human uniqueness and human exceptionalism in light of the image of God. Now, who were the Neanderthals? Well, before I discuss the Neanderthals, I want to maybe take a step back and talk a little bit about how I view the hominins in the fossil record. I think these were real creatures that existed. I think the dates that the scientific community has provided for these hominins are valid dates. But the way I view them is that these were creatures that God created that existed for a period of time and then went extinct. And that these creatures had intelligence and emotional capability, but they lacked the image of God. This is the model that I employ to explain the hominins. And I can have a long discussion as to why I think the case for human evolution is far from compelling, but I'm not going to get into that conversation this morning. And so in that context, the hominins were, the Neanderthals were hominins that existed somewhere between 200 and 45,000 years ago, living primarily in Europe, Middle East, and Western Asia. And what's exciting is there's a very rich fossil and archaeological record associated with Neanderthals, which really allows us to probe and characterize their biology and their behavior. Now, for the most part, there has been very little true evidence that anybody could cite in favor of Neanderthals possessing language or possessing symbolism and therefore producing art, though these claims will surface from time to time. But when you examine the claims carefully, you see that those claims don't hold up to any kind of real scrutiny. One of the most recent examples, for Neanderthal cave art was just published a couple of years ago. And the evidence for this cave art produced by Neanderthals is based on a new method that has been used to date the age of cave art. It used to be that the way people would do this is to scrape off a little bit of the charcoal that was used as the pigment to make the cave art. And of course, this isn't really something you want to do because you don't want to destroy the cave art in order to determine its age. So you could only take rather small samples and then perform radiocarbon dating. And when you're working with samples that are that small, it's very difficult to do radiocarbon dating in a reliable manner. And so there's a new technique that's been developed that's rather kind of slick, where people are taking advantage of the fact that in cave walls, there's water that runs down along the cave walls. And when it does, this mineral-rich water, will deposit calcite on the surface of the cave art. And that calcite will have trace amounts of uranium and thorium, which allows you to date the calcite using radiometric dating. And it's a much more reliable technique than it is to do radiocarbon dating. And so if you can actually find calcite layers underneath the art and on top of the art, you can sandwich the date of the art. And using that new technique, scientists went to a number of cave sites in Spain and basically dated the art using this technique. And most of the art that they dated was about 25,000 years in age. They found a hand stencil that dated at 37,000 years in age. But then they found these red discs that dated at 41,000 years in age, and they said, this must be Neanderthal art. Why did they conclude that? Because people thought that humans had not made their way into Europe at that time, and that Neanderthals were still in existence at that time, so they argued that the only actor that could produce this art would have been Neanderthals. This is the argument now for Neanderthal art. And then there's another study just published shortly after this one where scientists found these etch marks in the bedrock in a cave in Spain called Gorham's Cave. And the layers on top of that bedrock dated at about 38,000 years ago. And again, they argued, well, this must be evidence for Neanderthal art. The problem is that we now have improved radiometric methods to date modern human remains and Neanderthal remains, and we've now recognized that Neanderthals went extinct in Europe earlier than anybody thought, at around 45,000 years ago, maybe even earlier than that, and humans actually made their way into Europe earlier than anybody thought, closer to 45,000 years ago, meaning that the cave art was probably produced by humans, not Neanderthals. And that's a much more plausible explanation because we know humans were producing cave art since 40,000 years ago, since their arrival in Europe. We know that humans are making cave art in Southeast Asia that's identical to the cave art that is being attributed to Neanderthals. So the most reasonable explanation is that this is work done by modern humans, not Neanderthals, which lack any kind of evidence for artistic expression for the nearly 150, 200,000 years that they were in Europe. So it's not reasonable to think that this is, again, work produced by Neanderthals. How many of you have heard the claim that Neanderthals made musical instruments? A few of you. Well, the evidence for that are these bone flutes that are basically made from bird bones where there are holes punched in them, and the argument goes that these were Neanderthals producing musical instruments. The problem is there was a paper just published a few months ago where they showed that these holes were actually produced by hyena biting into bird bones in the cave sites, that this was not the product of either human or Neanderthal activity. This is simply an artifact of scavenging. Compare these so-called bone flutes to the oldest musical instrument we've discovered, which is in caves in Germany that dates at about 37,000 years in age. This flute is made out of ivory. Ivory is a solid material, and it's one of the best materials that these first humans would have had access to. To produce this flute would require a rather elaborate manufacturing process where it would have had to been produced in pieces that were very carefully fit together, and you can actually play this flute. I don't know if you can do a jazz tune on a flute like that, but it'd be fun to try, wouldn't it? Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz say this: among Neanderthals, all claimed instances of early symbolism are strongly disputed, and for Homo erectus, there are no specific claims of this kind at all. In other words, the archaeological record seems to support the idea that human beings really are unique, that we uniquely possess this capacity for symbolism. Schwartz and Tattersall say this: unusual though Homo sapiens may be morphologically, it is undoubtedly our remarkable cognitive qualities that most strikingly demarcate us from all other extant species. They are certainly what give us our strong subjective sense of being qualitatively different. And they are ultimately traceable to our symbolic capacity. Human beings alone, it seems, mentally dissect the world into a multitude of discrete symbols and combine and recombine those symbols in their minds to produce hypotheses of alternate possibilities. Symbolic and non-symbolic cognitive states are clearly separated by a qualitative gulf. The former is not simply an extension of the latter, a little bit more of the same. Schwartz and Tattersall are saying the same thing that Thomas Studendorf is saying, where Studendorf was comparing humans with the great apes, and Schwartz and Tattersall are comparing humans with Neanderthals, that we really truly are unique. Now, I've just got a few more minutes, and I want to talk about one other thing that's really provocative to me, and that has to do with the origin of language. Because again, language, like artistic expression and musical expression, is a manifestation of the capacity for symbolic expression. And I would argue again that language is a property intimately connected with the image of God. And many people have this perception that language evolved gradually over time, again, where the hominins possessed some kind of antecedent to language, and that the very first humans possessed a simple language that became increasingly complex over time. And it turns out that that view is rapidly eroding, and now you have anthropologists arguing that human language emerged suddenly, coincidentally with modern humans, and it's a property unique to modern humans, and that the very first language had a syntax that was as complex as modern day language. And I just want to close out my time by reading you two quotes from the scientific literature. The hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. By this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single, rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. What am I trying to communicate today? That as a Christian, I believe human beings are uniquely made in God's image. And that image of God is a really important idea and concept, because it means that if we bear God's image as human beings, all human beings have intrinsic worth and intrinsic dignity, and how we treat another human being is in effect how we treat God himself. And I believe that this idea of the image of God is foundational to ethics, and I also believe it's an idea that's foundational to the gospel itself. Because if we're human beings made in God's image, we were made to be in a relationship with our Creator, and when that relationship was marred as a result of the fall, that we were worthy of redemption because we bore God's image. And this idea of the image of God has, for the last 150 years, been consistently challenged by the prevailing scientific view of human evolution. But the fact of the matter is that when we look at the data, we see that the data seems to suggest that we're not different in degree, we're different in kind, in a way that's consistent with the image of God. That we are unique as human beings, that we stand alone, that we truly are exceptional. And I think that exceptionality begs an explanation that I think finds readily accounting for within the context of a Christian worldview. So thank you so much.